Right now, when people picture Christmas on the American frontier, they usually imagine something cozy and heroic. A log cabin. A pine tree dragged inside. A brave family smiling through the snow like they're posing for a painting that smells faintly of nostalgia. What actually happened was slower, quieter, and much less photogenic. Christmas existed, yes, but it was often cold, underfed, unfinished, and slightly disappointing. Most frontier families were not celebrating so much as continuing to exist while the calendar quietly flipped to December 25th. They marked the day because humans like dates, not because conditions improved. And while the rest of the world slowly industrialized and wrapped things in paper, the frontier kept doing what it always did. It endured. Calmly. Awkwardly. With very little sugar. If you enjoy long, quiet history like this, you can subscribe to the channel. And if you're listening right now, feel free to comment your city and the local time. It's always interesting to see where these stories drift off to. Chapter 1: A Day That Looked Like Every Other One. Before we go any further, this is a good moment to get comfortable. Maybe shift your weight a little. Let the room stay dim. Let the outside sounds do whatever they're doing. Nothing urgent is happening here. We're just stepping into a cabin that smells like wood smoke and damp wool, and we're going to stay there for a while. Christmas morning on the American frontier rarely announced itself. There were no alarms, no bells, no crowded schedules. The day began the same way most winter days did, with someone waking up because the fire had burned down too far. Cold was the real timekeeper. It crept into cabins during the night, slid under blankets, and rested on faces until someone finally moved. Children didn't leap out of bed. Adults didn't either. Everyone took a moment to remember where they were and how cold it felt. The cabin itself usually had one main room. Sometimes two, if the family was doing unusually well or had been there long enough to build again. The walls were thick logs, imperfectly fitted. Wind found its way through anyway. Snow sometimes did too. If the family had papered the cracks with old cloth or mud, it helped a little. Mostly it just changed the sound the wind made. On Christmas morning, the first task was the same as any other morning. Restart the fire. Someone had banked the coals the night before, hoping they would survive until dawn. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they didn't. When they didn't, Christmas began with friction. Flint. Steel. Sparks. Slow patience. Breath held too close to kindling. A quiet sense of irritation that this was taking longer than it should. No one said, "Merry Christmas," yet. That came later, if at all. Once the fire was going, the room slowly became usable. Not warm, exactly. Just less aggressive. People moved carefully, stiff from sleep and cold. Boots went on. Shawls were adjusted. A kettle was set near the fire, not because it was Christmas, but because water needed to be melted every single day. Food came next, in the same way it always did. Frontier families did not save special meals for Christmas unless they were unusually secure. Most weren't. Winter was when supplies shrank and decisions became smaller. Cornmeal. Salt pork. Dried beans. If there was flour, it was measured carefully. If there was sugar, it was used quietly, without ceremony. Breakfast might be mush. It might be nothing. If there was coffee, it was weak and shared. Children learned early not to ask for more. Asking implied that more existed. Often it didn't. Only after the morning routine was underway did Christmas become noticeable. Not because anything changed, but because someone mentioned it. Usually an adult. Usually in a practical tone. "It's Christmas today," they might say, as if noting the weather. Children nodded. Older children pretended not to care. Younger ones tried to feel excited and weren't entirely sure why. There were no wrapped presents waiting. Wrapping paper was not a frontier priority. Neither were unnecessary objects. Gifts, when they existed, were small, useful, and often already owned. A repaired tool. A piece of clothing finally finished. A book that had been read by everyone else already. Sometimes the gift was permission. Permission not to work quite as hard. Permission to stay inside a little longer. Permission to tell a story that had already been told many times before. For families who observed Christmas religiously, there might be a prayer. Not a long one. Not a dramatic one. Just a moment of acknowledgement. God had gotten them through another year. Or at least through most of it. That felt worth mentioning. Church services were rare. Distance made them impractical. Snow made them dangerous. A church might exist somewhere nearby, but nearby on the frontier was a flexible concept. 10 miles in winter might as well have been 50. Most families stayed home. Children often asked about Santa Claus, if they had heard of him at all. The idea traveled slowly west. Even when it arrived, it didn't always stick. Santa was a story for places with excess. Frontier parents adapted him as needed. He was busy. He got lost. He came late. He brought modest things. Sometimes he was quietly forgotten. Adults had their own quiet disappointments. Christmas reminded them of places they had left. Towns. Parents. Cemeteries with names already carved into stone. The day made absence more noticeable. It also made survival feel slightly heavier. Not tragic. Just persistent. Work still happened. Animals still needed feeding. Water still needed hauling. If a snowstorm had come through, paths needed clearing. The frontier did not pause for holidays. It barely acknowledged them. In some households, the afternoon brought a small treat. A pie if fruit had been preserved well enough. A bit of meat that had been saved deliberately. These moments mattered, but they weren't loud. Praise was internal. Gratitude was assumed. Children might play briefly. Not with toys so much as with each other. Games required imagination more than equipment. Laughter happened in short bursts, followed by long quiet stretches where everyone listened to the wind again. As daylight faded early, lamps were lit carefully. Oil was not wasted. Candles were watched closely. Firelight did most of the work. Shadows moved along the walls in familiar ways. No one commented on them. Stories came out in the evening. Old ones? Stories about the journey west. About storms survived. About neighbors who moved on or didn't. Christmas made people slightly more willing to talk, but not sentimental. Sentimentality was for later generations. Eventually, bedtime arrived. Not because the day was finished, but because there was nothing else to do. Beds were shared. Blankets were layered. The fire was banked again, with the same hope as the night before. Christmas ended the way it began. Quietly. Without announcement. The frontier did not celebrate surviving Christmas. It simply moved on to the next cold morning. And while that quietly carried on, across thousands of cabins and dugouts and sod houses, the idea of Christmas slowly changed. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just enough to be different the next time someone noticed the date and said it out loud. Chapter 2: Food that pretended to be a feast. By the time Christmas arrived on the frontier, food had already been decided for weeks, sometimes months. There was no last-minute planning. No sudden inspiration. Whatever was going to be eaten on December 25th had been sitting quietly in storage, aging, drying, hardening, or shrinking since autumn. The holiday did not improve ingredients, It only changed how people looked at them. Most frontier families entered winter with a mental inventory that never fully left their thoughts. Barrels were checked. Sacks were lifted and weighed by feel. Shelves were counted in the head, not on paper. Cornmeal lasted if it was protected from damp and mice. Salt pork lasted if the salt held and the barrel didn't leak. Beans lasted if no one got impatient. Fresh food disappeared first. That was expected. Chickens stopped laying. Gardens became memories. Hunting became harder, slower, and less reliable. When meat did appear, it was used carefully. Nothing dramatic was done with it. There were no roasts just because it was Christmas. A roast assumed confidence. Most people didn't have that. Christmas meals were usually slight upgrades of ordinary meals. The same components, arranged with a little more intention. Cornbread instead of plain mush, if flour allowed. Beans cooked longer. Meat added to a stew that usually relied on fat and hope. These changes were subtle enough that they didn't feel risky. Sugar, when it existed, was treated with near reverence. It might appear in a small pudding or be sprinkled lightly over bread. Children noticed immediately. Adults pretended not to. Sugar was not wasted on decoration. It was consumed quietly and without commentary. Spices were rare and old. Cinnamon and nutmeg sometimes appeared, having traveled a long way and survived many kitchens. They were used sparingly, not because of flavor, but because they represented connection. Someone, somewhere, had touched this spice before it reached the frontier. That felt worth acknowledging, even if no one said it out loud. Butter, if available, was a luxury shaped by temperature. In deep winter it was hard, pale, and stubborn. It was shaved rather than spread. Milk, if there was a cow, changed in winter. It was thinner. Sometimes it froze before it could be used. Cream was skimmed carefully and saved for moments like this, but even then, it might not cooperate. Baking was an event. Not a cheerful one. An event in the sense that it required planning, fuel, and attention. Ovens were unpredictable. Heat was uneven. Bread burned easily and stayed raw just as easily. Christmas did not improve these conditions. It only made failure feel more personal. Women, who handled most of this work, did not romanticize it. They worked methodically. They adapted recipes constantly. Measurements were guessed. Ingredients were substituted. Mistakes were accepted. Complaints were internal. Children were often kept out of the way during cooking, not because it was secretive, but because space was limited. A single-room cabin did not allow for crowds. Children hovered near the door or fire, absorbing smells and waiting to be told when something was ready. When the meal finally came together, it was eaten slowly. Not ceremoniously, but deliberately. Everyone was aware that this food was finite. No one rushed. No one piled plates high. Seconds were offered only if they truly existed. Conversation during the meal was steady and practical. Stories were told, but not at length. Someone might mention a Christmas from years before, back east, where things had been different. Someone else might nod and change the subject. Nostalgia was allowed, but not encouraged. After the meal, there were leftovers. That mattered more than the meal itself. Leftovers meant tomorrow would be easier. They were packed away carefully, protected from cold and animals. The future was always present, even on Christmas. Dishes were washed with cold water that stung the hands. Soap was rationed. Towels were reused. The work did not pause just because the day was marked. For some families, neighbors brought food. This was more common in settled areas where distance was manageable. A pie carried through snow. A slab of meat shared quietly. These exchanges were not festive. They were functional kindness. No one expected thanks beyond a nod. In lean years, Christmas meals were indistinguishable from any other meal. That reality was accepted early in frontier life. Children learned quickly not to expect magic from dates. Adults learned not to promise it. The idea of abundance existed mostly as a story. Stories of towns where shops overflowed. Stories of places where oranges appeared in winter and no one questioned it. On the frontier, abundance was something that happened occasionally and then left again. Yet food, even limited food, anchored the day. It gave Christmas shape. It reminded people that survival included moments of pause, even if the pause tasted like beans and salt. And while families quietly washed their bowls and returned leftovers to shelves, the frontier winter continued outside. Snow settled deeper. Trails disappeared. The land remained indifferent to the calendar. Somewhere else, someone was eating something similar, at a similar table, in a similar cabin. The sameness of it was almost comforting. Not joyful. Just steady. And as evening returned and hunger faded temporarily, people prepared themselves for the next day. Christmas food was gone. Winter food remained. Chapter 3. Work that did not take the day off. Christmas on the frontier did not interrupt labor. It barely slowed it down. The land had no awareness of dates, and neither did the animals. Cows needed milking whether or not the calendar suggested rest. Horses needed feeding. Wood still needed splitting. Water still needed hauling, sometimes from farther away as streams froze solid. The morning after Christmas looked almost exactly like the morning before it. In many cases, so did Christmas itself. Work had been postponed only if it was genuinely impossible, and even then, postponement created more work later. Frontier families learned early that delay was a luxury. Christmas did not grant it. Men stepped outside into the cold with the same routines they followed every winter morning. Boots stiff from freezing were worked loose with patience. Breath fogged the air immediately. Tools were handled carefully, because metal burned skin in winter just as effectively as fire. Chopping wood was a constant task. Christmas increased neither the supply nor the demand. Fires burned the same. Axes swung the same. The only difference was a slight awareness that this was supposed to be a special day. That awareness rarely changed behavior. Women worked inside and out, depending on need. Laundry, if attempted at all in winter, was a long, uncomfortable process involving frozen cloth and numbed fingers. More often, it was postponed until survival tasks were complete. Cooking, mending, and tending children filled the rest of the time. Children were expected to help, even on Christmas. Not because parents were cruel, but because work was how families functioned. Carrying wood, fetching water, watching younger siblings. These tasks did not pause for holidays. Childhood on the frontier was not divided neatly into workdays and celebrations. Some families allowed children a small break, a symbolic one. An hour without chores. Permission to play near the house. Even this was monitored. Winter was dangerous. Frostbite did not care if it was Christmas. Livestock represented months of labor and future survival. Animals were checked repeatedly. Shelter was reinforced if storms threatened. Feed was rationed carefully. A sick animal on Christmas was treated the same as a sick animal on any other day, with quiet urgency and no ceremony. Frontier men sometimes used Christmas as an excuse to repair tools they had been meaning to fix. Not because the day demanded it, but because the rhythm of work felt slightly looser. A handle replaced. A blade sharpened. These small improvements were their version of marking time. For women, Christmas sometimes meant finishing long-delayed mending. A shirt finally patched properly. Socks reinforced. These tasks were not festive, but they were satisfying in a quiet way. Completion mattered more than celebration. In communities where settlers lived close enough to see one another regularly, work occasionally became shared on Christmas. A neighbor helped another clear snow. Someone checked on an elderly couple. These acts were not framed as charity. They were practical responses to winter. There were also people who worked entirely alone. Trappers, prospectors, homesteaders without families. Christmas for them passed almost unnoticed. They marked it, perhaps, by eating something slightly better or speaking out loud to no one. Then they returned to work. The absence of formal rest made Christmas feel less distinct, but not meaningless. The meaning came from continuity. Work was how people stayed alive. Continuing it meant they would likely see another year. As daylight faded, work shifted indoors. Tools were put away. Animals settled. The cabin filled with the familiar smells of smoke, wool, and human presence. Christmas did not change these things. It simply sat among them. Evening work was quieter. Hands moved automatically. Needles passed through cloth. Wood was stacked near the fire. Children listened more than they spoke. Adults thought about what still needed to be done tomorrow. The idea of leisure existed, but it was thin. Leisure meant sitting near the fire without moving for a few minutes. It meant telling a story while hands kept working. It meant stopping before exhaustion, rather than after. Christmas did not bring music unless someone already knew it. Fiddles existed, but not everywhere. Songs were sung softly or not at all. Silence was common and accepted. By the end of the day, bodies were tired in familiar ways. Muscles ached. Joints protested. Christmas did not exempt anyone from that. If anything, the cold made it worse. Sleep came quickly. Not because of peace or contentment, but because energy was finite. Tomorrow would require it again. And while work continued, unchanged and uncelebrated, Christmas passed through the frontier the way all days did. Quietly. Without asking for permission. Chapter 4: Small Rituals That Almost Counted. Even when work continued and food stayed plain, people still looked for ways to mark Christmas as something slightly separate from the rest of winter. These efforts were modest, often improvised, and sometimes so small they barely registered. Still, they existed, and for frontier families, that was enough. Rituals did not arrive fully formed. They were assembled from memory, habit, and whatever materials happened to be nearby. A pine branch brought inside and leaned against the wall. A candle saved for the evening instead of burned earlier. A book taken down from a shelf where it rarely moved. These gestures were quiet acknowledgments that the day mattered, even if conditions did not improve. Decoration was minimal to the point of abstraction. A bit of greenery was common, not because it was festive, but because it was one of the few living things still available. Evergreens held their color through winter, and that alone made them useful. Branches were placed above doors or on tables, shedding needles slowly as the day went on. No one minded. Mess was constant anyway. Some families marked the day with a specific meal or object tied to older traditions. German settlers might bake something they remembered from childhood, adapted heavily to frontier reality. Scandinavian families carried quiet habits involving bread or candles. These practices survived because they were flexible. Rigid traditions did not travel well. Reading aloud was one of the most common Christmas rituals, mostly because it required very little. If a family owned a Bible, it was often used. Familiar passages were read slowly, sometimes unevenly, depending on who was reading. Other books appeared too, if they existed. A worn novel. A collection of sermons. Something with a cover already frayed from years of use. Children listened with varying degrees of attention. Some absorbed the words. Others watched the fire. Others fell asleep. No one insisted on perfect focus. The act itself was the point, not the outcome. Prayer, when it happened, was brief and practical. Gratitude was expressed for survival, health, and shelter. Requests were vague and cautious. People did not ask for abundance. They asked for continuation. Music, if it happened at all, was unpolished. Someone might hum. Someone else might remember part of a hymn. Instruments were rare and often out of tune. Songs ended early or wandered off into silence. This was accepted without comment. Gift-giving, when present, was understated. Gifts were not surprises. They were usually expected and practical. A knife. A scarf. A repaired item returned quietly. Children learned not to perform excitement. Gratitude was shown through use, not reaction. In some families, Christmas was marked by storytelling. Not formal stories, but remembered moments. The journey west. The first winter. A storm that almost ended things. These stories were not told to entertain. They were told to remind everyone where they were and how they got there. Older family members were often the center of these moments, not because of age alone, but because they carried the most memory. Christmas created a small pause where listening felt appropriate. For children, rituals were especially important, even if they did not understand them fully. These moments separated Christmas from the long, indistinguishable stretch of winter days. They gave shape to time. Not all families bothered with rituals. Some were too tired. Some had lost people recently. Some simply did not see the point. Christmas passed in these households without markers, and no one judged them for it. Survival did not require ceremony. In communities with shared spaces, small gatherings occurred. A neighbor's cabin might host a few extra people for an hour or two. Conversation stayed light. People watched the weather. Food was shared carefully. Then everyone returned home before dark. These gatherings did not feel festive in a modern sense. They felt cautious. Winter discouraged lingering. Distance discouraged excess. As evening settled in, the rituals ended naturally. Candles burned low. Books were closed. Branches drooped. No one announced the end of Christmas. It simply ran out of daylight. The quiet after these small rituals was noticeable. The cabin returned to its usual rhythm. Fire, shadow, breathing. The sense of having marked something faded quickly. Yet the act of marking it mattered. Even a small ritual created a mental note. This day was different, even if only slightly. That difference carried people through the rest of winter more than any gift or feast could. And while these rituals faded into memory, replaced by the next day's work, they left behind a subtle residue. A reminder that time still moved forward, even when everything else felt frozen. Chapter 5. Children who learn not to expect much. Children on the American frontier learned very early that Christmas was not a delivery system. It did not arrive carrying abundance, surprise, or spectacle. It arrived the same way everything else did, quietly and with conditions attached. This understanding settled in gradually, shaped by observation more than explanation. Young children still approached the day with curiosity. They noticed when adults behaved slightly differently. They noticed when food smelled better than usual, or when a candle was lit later in the evening. These details stood out against the long sameness of winter. Excitement existed, but it was cautious and often short-lived. Stories about Christmas magic traveled west slowly and unevenly. Some children had heard of Santa Claus from books, travelers, or older relatives. Others hadn't. Even when they had, the version they encountered was practical and restrained. Santa did not arrive in the night unnoticed. He did not bring piles of toys. He was a concept more than a character, adapted to fit limited circumstances. Parents rarely promised anything specific. Promises were dangerous. Children learned to interpret vague language carefully. "We'll see" carried more weight than certainty. A nod meant possibility, not assurance. Gifts, when they appeared, were often items children had already seen being made or repaired. A doll sewn from scraps. A carved animal from leftover wood. A pair of mittens knitted slowly over many evenings. Children understood the labor involved, even if they could not articulate it. Appreciation came quietly. The absence of gifts did not always disappoint. Many children did not know what they were missing. Their expectations were shaped by their surroundings. They compared Christmas to yesterday, not to some imagined elsewhere. Older children, especially those who worked regularly, treated Christmas as a pause rather than an event. A day when chores might be lighter. A day when adults might be more tolerant of rest. That mattered more than objects. Children also learned that Christmas could be emotionally complicated. Adults sometimes became quieter. Conversations drifted toward people who were not there. Children noticed names spoken carefully, pauses that lasted longer than usual. These moments were absorbed without explanation. Winter limited play. Snow offered opportunities, but it also imposed boundaries. Children played close to home, bundled and stiff. Games were invented quickly and abandoned just as quickly when fingers went numb. Inside, children listened. They listened to stories they had heard before. They listened to adults talk about plans for spring. They listened to the fire. Silence was not uncomfortable to them. It was normal. Education did not pause for Christmas. Reading, when it happened at all, continued. Chores continued. Responsibilities continued. Children were expected to behave the same way they did every other day. Some children experienced Christmas in multiple households over time. Moves were common. Deaths were common. These transitions shaped their understanding of the holiday. Christmas became associated with change rather than stability. For children who had lost siblings or parents, Christmas could feel especially thin. Adults did not shield them from loss. There was no language for that kind of protection. Grief existed alongside routine, and children learned to hold both. Yet children also found moments of comfort. Sitting near the fire longer than usual. Being allowed to stay awake later. Hearing laughter, even brief laughter. These moments were small but noticeable. As children grew older, Christmas became less distinct. It blended into winter. Some barely remembered it had passed. Others marked it privately, carrying forward small habits learned early on. The frontier did not teach children to resent Christmas. It taught them to scale it down, to expect continuity rather than transformation. These children grew up to recreate Christmas in similar ways. Not because they lacked imagination, but because they understood what was sustainable. What could be repeated year after year without collapse. And while children slept that night, wrapped in layers and breathing slowly, Christmas settled into memory. Not as a highlight, but as a familiar marker. Another winter survived. Another year quietly underway. Chapter 6. People who were not surrounded by family. Not everyone on the American frontier spent Christmas in a crowded cabin with familiar voices. In fact, a significant number of people spent the day in near silence, either by circumstance or by design. The frontier produced isolation naturally. Distance did most of the work. Weather finished the job. Single men were common. Trappers, hired hands, surveyors, prospectors, and laborers who moved wherever work appeared. Many of them had families somewhere else. Others never had. Christmas did not pull them home. It simply reminded them that home existed in theory, if not in practice. For these men, Christmas morning began like any other. They woke when cold demanded it. They ate whatever food was available. They checked gear. They assessed weather. The day did not announce itself unless they chose to acknowledge it. Some did acknowledge it quietly. A longer pause before work. A remembered date spoken out loud. A small ration saved deliberately and eaten without comment. These gestures were private and unobserved. Loneliness on the frontier was not dramatic. It did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated slowly, settling into daily routine until it felt ordinary. Christmas did not create loneliness so much as expose it briefly, like a thin place in winter clothing where the cold suddenly felt sharper. Women experienced isolation differently, but just as steadily. Frontier wives often lived miles from the nearest neighbor. Winter could cut off even that connection. Christmas arrived without visitors, letters, or interruption. Children helped, but adult conversation was rare. Letters, when they existed, were treasured. A letter arriving near Christmas carried extra weight. Not because of the holiday itself, but because it confirmed continuity. Someone elsewhere still remembered the date. Someone still thought in terms of seasons and traditions. Many people did not receive letters. Mail was unreliable. Routes were long. Snow delayed everything. Christmas passed with no word from anyone beyond the immediate household. For widows and widowers, Christmas was often the quietest day of the year. The routines remained, but the absence was sharper. Meals felt unfinished. Conversations ended early. Memories surfaced without warning. There were no grief rituals specific to Christmas. Mourning blended into daily life. The day did not demand cheer, so there was no pressure to perform it. That made grief easier to carry, if not lighter. In some cases, isolation led people to seek out others deliberately. A long walk through snow to reach another cabin. An invitation extended with no expectation of return. These visits were practical responses to winter solitude, not celebrations. When people gathered, they did not speak much about being alone. The fact spoke for itself. Presence was enough. Sitting in the same room, even silently, counted as connection. Frontier hospitality was functional. A place to sit. Something warm to drink. Food shared carefully. No one overstayed. No one expected entertainment. For people living completely alone, Christmas sometimes passed without spoken words. Days without speech were not unusual on the frontier. Christmas simply added meaning to the silence. Some marked the day by writing. Journals were common among settlers. Entries on December 25th were often brief. Christmas Day. Cold. Or, worked as usual. These notes were not dismissive. They were accurate. The act of writing the date mattered. It anchored the person in time. It confirmed that the day had occurred, even if nothing else distinguished it. Religious observance among isolated individuals was highly personal. Some prayed. Some did not. Some read scripture. Others avoided it entirely. Faith adapted to solitude in the same way everything else did. Isolation also affected immigrants differently. Christmas traditions carried from other countries sometimes felt sharper in solitude. Songs remembered but not sung. Foods remembered but unavailable. These memories surfaced quietly and then receded. Not everyone experienced loneliness negatively. Some preferred the simplicity of the day. Christmas without expectation suited them. It required nothing extra. It allowed the day to pass cleanly. The frontier did not frame solitude as failure. It treated it as a condition. One that might change, or might not. As evening came, Isolated individuals prepared for night the same way they always did. Fires were banked. Doors were secured. Supplies were checked. Christmas did not reduce risk. Sleep came unevenly for some. Thoughts wandered more than usual. Memories surfaced without structure. Others slept deeply, exhausted and undisturbed. The next morning, December 26th, arrived without transition. Work resumed fully. The calendar moved forward. Christmas became something that had happened, briefly, quietly, and mostly unnoticed. And across the frontier, in cabins both crowded and empty, that quiet passage was the most common Christmas experience of all. Chapter 7. Weather that quietly decided everything. If there was one presence that shaped Christmas on the American frontier more than food, work, or tradition, it was weather. Weather was not background. It was the primary condition under which everything else occurred. Christmas did not arrive despite winter. It arrived inside it, fully enclosed. Winter weather determined how the day unfolded before anyone made a single choice. A mild day allowed movement, visits, and small indulgences. A harsh one erased plans entirely. Snow, wind, and cold did not negotiate. They simply arrived and stayed. Blizzards were not dramatic events in memory the way they are now. They were prolonged inconveniences with consequences. Snow did not fall for an afternoon and then stop. It accumulated, drifted, hardened, and stayed. Christmas sometimes disappeared under it without comment. Cold settled into everything. Doors stuck. Water froze in buckets. Ink thickened. Fingers lost precision. These were not crises. They were constants. Christmas did not soften them. Wind altered the shape of days. It crept through cracks in cabins, extinguished candles, and made outdoor work harder than usual. Wind was listened to carefully. Its sound told people how serious the day would be. Storms isolated families more effectively than distance ever could. A neighbor 2 miles away might as well have been on another continent during a heavy snowfall. Christmas gatherings were canceled without discussion. Safety replaced sentiment. Travel on Christmas was rare and risky. Wagons struggled. Horses faltered. Paths vanished. People who attempted visits did so cautiously, often turning back before arrival. No one judged these decisions. Winter set limits that everyone respected. Weather also shaped mood. Long stretches of gray sky flattened emotion. Christmas did not brighten winter in any reliable way. At best, it created contrast. At worst, it highlighted how long winter still had to go. Frontier people did not complain about weather often. Complaining implied expectation. They observed instead. They adjusted. Christmas weather was noted in journals and memory, not criticized. Children were especially aware of weather. It defined their movement and play. A mild Christmas allowed snow games close to home. A severe one confined them indoors, restless but accustomed. Adults watched weather with calculation. How much would remain? How secure the roof felt. Whether animals could stay sheltered. Christmas did not reduce vigilance. In some years, Christmas storms became reference points. The Christmas snow, or the Christmas freeze, entered local memory. These events were remembered not for the holiday, but for their impact. Weather also influenced sound. Snow absorbed noise. Cabins felt quieter during heavy snowfall. Christmas in these conditions felt muted, even more subdued than usual. Clear nights brought cold so sharp it seemed deliberate. Stars appeared brighter. Breath crystallized. Christmas under clear skies felt exposed rather than peaceful. The frontier taught people to read weather instinctively. Clouds, wind shifts, temperature changes. Christmas did not interrupt that awareness. It heightened it slightly, because mistakes felt less forgivable on marked days. There were no weather forecasts. People relied on experience and observation. Predictions were cautious and vague. It looks like it may turn. That was enough. Weather also dictated memory. People remembered Christmases not by gifts or meals, but by conditions. The year the river froze solid. The year the snow never stopped. The year the wind tore shingles loose. These memories were shared quietly, often years later, without embellishment. Weather did not need exaggeration. It had done enough on its own. As Christmas ended and winter continued, weather remained the dominant force. It shaped January and February more aggressively. Christmas was just one point along that stretch. The frontier did not romanticize winter. It respected it. Christmas existed within that respect, shaped by forces far larger than tradition. And as snows settled again and wind moved on, Christmas faded back into winter, leaving behind only the memory of how the weather behaved that year. Chapter 8. Belief that adapted to colder rooms. Religion on the American frontier did not disappear during Christmas, but it did compress. It became smaller, quieter, and more portable. Belief had to fit into cabins with low ceilings and limited light. It had to work without churches, choirs, or certainty that anyone else was participating at the same time. For many families, faith was already part of daily life. Christmas did not add much to it. It simply nudged certain thoughts closer to the surface. Gratitude. Endurance. A vague hope that the coming year would not be worse than the last. Formal worship was rare in winter. Ministers traveled when they could, but weather decided most schedules. A Christmas sermon might arrive weeks late, or not at all. No one complained. The frontier accepted delay as normal. When ministers did appear near Christmas, their visits were remembered. Not because of the message, but because of the effort involved. Someone had traveled a long distance in bad weather just to speak familiar words. That counted for something. Most religious practice happened at home. Bibles were read slowly, often by candlelight. Passages were chosen less for relevance than for familiarity. People returned to what they knew would hold up under repetition. Children learned scripture the same way they learned chores. Gradually. Imperfectly. With interruptions. Christmas did not turn them into attentive listeners overnight. Prayer was practical. People prayed for health, weather, and endurance. Christmas prayers did not dwell on joy. They acknowledged survival. That felt appropriate. Some settlers brought strong religious traditions with them. Others adopted belief unevenly. The frontier did not enforce consistency. Faith adapted or faded depending on circumstance. Christmas highlighted these differences quietly. Some families marked the day explicitly. Others barely mentioned it. No one policed belief. Distance prevented that. For immigrants, Christmas faith often carried memories of more elaborate observance. Bells, processions, public gatherings. These memories surfaced gently and then receded. Recreating them was impractical. Remembering them was enough. There were also settlers who had little interest in religion at all. Christmas passed for them as a cultural marker rather than a sacred one. They observed the date, not the theology. Frontier belief was not abstract. It was situational. It addressed weather, illness, and uncertainty. Christmas fit into that framework as a reminder, not a transformation. Illness was common in winter. Christmas prayers often focused on recovery rather than celebration. Sick children did not care what day it was. Adults knew that. Death, when it occurred near Christmas, did not receive special treatment. Burials happened when ground allowed. Morning followed the same slow pattern it always did. The holiday did not interrupt grief. Some people found comfort in belief during Christmas. Others felt its absence more sharply. Both reactions were accepted without commentary. Church buildings, when they existed, were simple. A Christmas service, if held, was brief and sparsely attended. Candles flickered. Breath was visible. People did not linger. Music, when included, was restrained. Hymns were sung softly, sometimes without accompaniment. Voices blended imperfectly. That imperfection was normal. For many, the most religious moment of Christmas was silence. Sitting near the fire, listening to wind, thinking about continuity. Belief did not always require words. Faith also shaped how people viewed hardship. Christmas did not promise relief. It offered framing. Suffering was not random. Or at least, it could be interpreted that way. As winter continued, religious routines returned to baseline. Christmas-specific practices faded quickly. What remained was the same steady, adaptable belief that carried people through the rest of the season. The frontier did not demand certainty. It rewarded flexibility. Religion that survived Christmas did so because it bent rather than insisted. And as candles burned down and Bibles returned to shelves, belief settled back into daily life, quieter than before, but still present enough to be useful. Chapter 9. Time that moved differently out there. Time on the American frontier did not behave the way it did in cities or towns with clocks, schedules, and regular interruptions. It moved according to light, weather, and exhaustion. Christmas existed within this slower system, and that changed how it was experienced. Most frontier homes did not own reliable clocks. Some had none at all. Time was measured by the fire, by hunger, by the position of the sun. In winter, daylight shrank so much that days felt abbreviated. Christmas arrived and passed within that compressed window. Without strict schedules, anticipation softened. There was no countdown. No calendar pages dramatically turned. Christmas was known to be coming, but it did not loom. It approached quietly, like everything else. The absence of timekeeping also meant that Christmas did not have a clear beginning or end. Midnight held no special significance. People were asleep. Morning was when cold demanded movement, not when a new day was officially declared. Children experienced this most clearly. They did not wait for midnight. They waited for adults to wake. Christmas morning was defined by activity, not by the clock. Adults, too, felt time blur. Days in winter were repetitive. One blended into the next. Christmas stood out only slightly, marked by memory rather than sensation. Long nights stretched perception. Evenings lasted longer than days. Sitting near the fire, listening to wind, time felt suspended. Christmas nights did not feel special so much as familiar. Work broke time into manageable pieces. Tasks defined the day. Once tasks were done, time loosened. Christmas altered task lists slightly, but not enough to change the structure of the day. Seasonal awareness mattered more than dates. People thought in terms of before winter, deep winter, and thaw. Christmas was part of deep winter. It did not stand alone. Memory organized time differently as well. People remembered years by events rather than dates. The year the barn burned. The year the crops failed. Christmas appeared in these memories as context, not cause. Journals reflect this relationship with time. Entries around Christmas were brief and factual. There was no sense of occasion requiring elaboration. Writing itself took time and energy. Time also moved unevenly depending on age. For children, winter felt endless. Christmas was a small interruption in a long stretch of cold. For adults, winter passed quickly and slowly at the same time, measured by resources rather than hours. Illness altered time perception dramatically. Days spent caring for the sick blurred together. Christmas did not punctuate that experience. It faded into routine. The frontier also lacked external reminders of time passing. No bells. No public celebrations. No shop windows changing displays. Christmas did not announce itself visually. Silence contributed to this altered sense of time. Without constant noise, moments stretched. Christmas silence felt no different from any other winter silence. For some, this made Christmas feel meaningless. For others, it made it more personal. Without external pressure, individuals decided what the day meant to them. As years passed, settlers carried this altered sense of time with them. Even when towns grew and clocks appeared, the memory of slow time lingered. Christmas eventually changed as infrastructure arrived. But in the early frontier years, it remained embedded in a different temporal rhythm. When December 26th arrived, it did not feel like a transition. It felt like continuation. Christmas was absorbed back into winter without resistance. Time on the frontier did not celebrate milestones. It endured them. Christmas was one more point along a long, uneven line. And as that line extended forward, year after year, Christmas remained less an event than a reference. A quiet marker in a season that did not hurry for anyone. Chapter 10. Things people remembered later, not at the time. Most people living on the American frontier did not think of Christmas as something they were actively creating. They were not aware that they were participating in a particular version of the holiday. That awareness came later, often years later, when circumstances changed enough to allow comparison. Memory did most of the work. At the time, Christmas was simply a day that happened during winter. It did not announce its future importance. No one paused to record how different it felt from other Christmases, because there were few other kinds to compare it to. The frontier version was the only one they knew. It was only after towns formed, stores appeared, and mail became reliable that people began to look back. Suddenly Christmas came with objects, lights, and expectations. That contrast made earlier Christmases noticeable in retrospect. Older settlers sometimes spoke about those early holidays with a tone that sounded like nostalgia but was actually recognition. They were not longing to return to them. They were acknowledging that they had existed. Memory simplified things. Hardships softened at the edges. Cold cabins became cozy. Sparse meals became simple. Silence became peaceful. These were not lies exactly. They were reinterpretations. When people told stories about frontier Christmases, they focused on details that survived memory. The year the snow was unusually deep. The Christmas when someone finally arrived with news from home. The time a neighbor showed up unexpectedly with food. They rarely spoke about the long stretches of nothing in between. Memory does not hold empty space well. It compresses time and selects moments. Children who grew up on the frontier remembered Christmas differently as adults. What had felt normal then felt remarkable later. The absence of gifts became a story. The quiet became a virtue. Some felt pride. They had endured something. Christmas became part of that endurance narrative. Not because it was harder than other days, but because it symbolized continuity. Others felt relief that things had changed. They spoke about frontier Christmases with gratitude that they no longer lived that way. Memory allowed for both interpretations. Letters written years later sometimes referenced early Christmases briefly. "Do you remember that Christmas in the cabin?" No explanation followed. None was needed. Memory also filtered emotion. Loneliness remembered itself differently. Isolation became independence. Silence became self-reliance. Christmas took on meanings it did not carry at the time. This process was gradual. It did not happen the year after leaving the frontier. It happened after enough distance accumulated. People who never left the frontier remembered Christmas less distinctly. It remained part of an unbroken pattern. Without contrast, memory did not elevate it. As frontier settlements grew into towns, Christmas slowly changed. Stores offered items labeled as gifts. Decorations appeared. Public gatherings became possible. These changes were welcomed, mostly. Yet even as Christmas grew louder, some people resisted the noise. They remembered earlier versions that required nothing extra. That memory influenced how they celebrated later. Frontier Christmas traditions were not intentionally preserved. They lingered quietly in habits. Modest meals. Limited decoration. Emphasis on presence rather than spectacle. These habits passed down unevenly. Some families carried them forward deliberately. Others let them fade. Memory shaped inheritance as much as choice. When historians later described frontier Christmases, they often emphasized hardship. That emphasis was accurate, but incomplete. Hardship was constant. Christmas was not uniquely difficult. It was simply not exempt. What made frontier Christmas distinct was not suffering, but restraint. Restraint born of necessity rather than ideology. That distinction mattered to those who remembered it. Memory also introduced narrative. People framed early Christmases as beginnings. The first Christmas west. The first Christmas in the new cabin. These milestones mattered later more than they did at the time. At the time, people were too busy surviving winter to mark beginnings. They marked continuations. As decades passed, Christmas became a way to measure change. We didn't have this back then. That phrase appeared often in recollections. It carried no bitterness. Just observation. Memory turned frontier Christmas into something instructive. Proof that celebration did not require abundance. Proof that meaning could exist without display. These lessons were not universal. Not everyone agreed. Memory is selective, and interpretation varies. Still, frontier Christmas endured in stories because it contrasted so strongly with what came after. It became a reference point for simplicity, whether accurate or not. In reality, those Christmases were neither noble nor tragic. They were practical. They fit their environment. When people remembered them later, they remembered the parts that aligned with their present values. Quiet. Endurance. Family. The parts that did not align faded. Hunger. Exhaustion. Disappointment. This is not dishonesty. It is how memory works. And so frontier Christmas lives on, not as it was lived, but as it was later understood. A quieter holiday. A smaller one. A day that did not ask for much and did not offer much either. At the time, it was just another winter day with a name. Later, it became something worth remembering. Chapter 11. When the frontier slowly stopped being the frontier. Frontier Christmas did not disappear all at once. It thinned out gradually, the way isolation always does when roads improve and neighbors multiply. There was no single year when people woke up and realized they were no longer living on the frontier. Christmas changed quietly, one small convenience at a time. The first shift came with reliability. Reliable mail. Reliable supply lines. Reliable visits. When letters began arriving more consistently in December, Christmas started to feel synchronized. People became aware that others were marking the same day at the same time. Stores were another turning point. At first they offered necessities. Then, slowly, they offered choices. Items that were not strictly required for survival. Sugar became easier to obtain. Fabric appeared in greater variety. Small, unnecessary objects began to exist. Christmas noticed these changes before most other days did. Not because it demanded them, but because it absorbed them easily. A store-bought ribbon, a tin of sweets, a toy that required no explanation. Decoration expanded carefully. Evergreen branches remained, but they were joined by purchased ornaments, crude at first, then more refined. Candles became more plentiful. Light increased. Food changed too. Flour became more consistent. Spices less rare. Recipes stabilized. Christmas meals became distinct rather than slightly improved versions of everyday fare. Children noticed the change immediately. Expectations grew. Stories about Christmas magic traveled faster now, carried by books, newspapers, and travelers. Santa Claus became more specific. Adults adjusted unevenly. Some embraced the changes. Others felt wary. More expectation meant more obligation. Christmas risked becoming something that required effort beyond survival. Churches became more accessible. Christmas services grew more formal. Music improved. Gatherings expanded. Community became more visible. Yet even as Christmas grew outward, remnants of frontier habits remained. People still valued restraint. Excess felt unfamiliar. Celebration was tempered by memory. Work still intruded. Animals still needed care. Weather still dictated movement. Christmas did not become fully exempt from reality. In many places, frontier and town existed side by side. Some families celebrated in newer ways. Others continued quietly. No single version dominated immediately. Older settlers often commented on the changes without judgment. "It's different now." That statement carried observation rather than criticism. Christmas also became something that could be postponed or advanced deliberately. Celebrations scheduled. Invitations planned. Time became more structured. This structure altered the feel of the day. Christmas gained anticipation and aftermath. It became an event rather than a moment. Memories shifted again. Frontier Christmas moved further into the past. It became a contrast point rather than a lived experience. New generations did not experience the frontier version directly. They heard about it secondhand, filtered through memory and storytelling. These stories sometimes emphasized simplicity as virtue. Other times they emphasized hardship as warning. Both interpretations coexisted. As infrastructure expanded, isolation diminished. Christmas no longer arrived alone. It arrived accompanied by goods, news, and expectation. Yet weather continued to assert itself. Storms still canceled plans. Cold still limited movement. The frontier never fully relinquished control. Some remote areas retained frontier Christmas practices longer than others. Distance prolonged older rhythms. Change arrived unevenly. By the time the frontier officially closed, frontier Christmas already belonged mostly to memory. It had been replaced not by something better or worse, but by something different. What remained were habits. Quiet mornings. Modest meals. Emphasis on togetherness over display. These habits persisted even when abundance allowed otherwise. The frontier did not disappear. It receded. Christmas changed with it, adapting again. And for those who remembered the older version, Christmas carried layers. The present celebrations sat atop older, quieter ones. They did not feel loss. They felt accumulation. Frontier Christmas became part of the foundation rather than the structure. Invisible, but still supporting what came after. The day itself remained December 25th. What changed was everything around it. And as the frontier faded into history, its version of Christmas lingered, not in practice, but in tone. Quiet. Unassuming. Enduring. Chapter 12. a holiday that never tried to impress anyone. By the time Christmas settled into something recognizable across the American frontier, it had already given up any ambition of being impressive. It did not try to dazzle. It did not attempt to distract people from their circumstances. It simply existed alongside them, shaped by the same limits that shaped everything else. This was not a deliberate philosophy. No one held meetings about keeping Christmas modest. Modesty emerged naturally when excess was unavailable. The holiday adapted the way frontier life always adapted, by becoming smaller, quieter, and easier to carry. What mattered most was not what happened on Christmas, but what did not. There were no sudden reversals of fortune. No guaranteed moments of joy. No expectation that the day would fix anything that had gone wrong during the year. Christmas was not asked to do that work. Because expectations were low, disappointment rarely arrived dramatically. Children might feel a brief letdown, but it passed quickly. Adults were spared the comparison between what was hoped for and what actually occurred. The day rarely failed, because it promised very little. This made Christmas strangely resilient. It did not collapse under hardship. It bent and continued. In years of scarcity, it shrank. In years of relative comfort, it expanded slightly. It never insisted on a fixed form. Frontier Christmas also did not divide people sharply into celebrators and non-celebrators. Participation was informal. Partial observance counted. Simply acknowledging the date counted. Silence counted. People who wanted to mark the day could do so quietly without explanation. People who did not could let it pass. No one monitored enthusiasm. The lack of spectacle also meant there was little pressure to remember Christmas vividly. It did not demand to be recorded or commemorated. It did not leave behind piles of objects or photographs. Its traces were subtle. Memory of these Christmases often resurfaced unexpectedly. Years later, a smell of wood smoke. The sound of wind against a wall. A simple meal eaten slowly. These fragments carried more emotional weight than any single event ever had. Frontier Christmas trained people to notice these small things. Not intentionally, but through repetition. When little else changed, minor variations became meaningful. The holiday also reinforced the idea that continuity mattered more than intensity. Another winter survived. Another year turned. Christmas fit neatly into that rhythm without disrupting it. For people accustomed to this version of Christmas, later, louder versions sometimes felt excessive. Not offensive, just unfamiliar. Too many instructions. Too many expectations. Others embraced the change gladly. They welcomed color, sound, and abundance. The frontier had not taught them to reject pleasure, only to live without it when necessary. These differing reactions coexisted peacefully. Memory allowed room for both appreciation and relief. Frontier Christmas also left behind a subtle ethic. That celebration did not need to be visible to be real. That meaning could exist without performance. That a day could matter without being transformed into an event. This ethic did not survive everywhere. It was diluted as generations passed. But traces of it appeared whenever someone chose simplicity over display, even when abundance was available. The frontier version of Christmas did not claim moral superiority. It did not argue that less was better. It simply demonstrated that less was workable. That distinction mattered. It prevented nostalgia from becoming judgment. When people spoke about those early Christmases, they often did so with neutrality. That's how it was. The phrase carried acceptance rather than longing. The frontier itself demanded that kind of emotional posture. Too much attachment to how things should be made daily life harder. Christmas followed that rule. There were no traditions that absolutely had to happen. No rituals that could not be skipped. Flexibility was built in. This flexibility allowed Christmas to survive conditions that might have broken a more rigid holiday. It adapted to snowstorms, illness, isolation, and loss without losing its identity entirely. Its identity, such as it was, rested on presence. Being there. Marking the day in whatever way was possible. Then moving on. This approach also meant that Christmas did not dominate winter. It occupied a small space and then stepped aside. Winter continued uninterrupted. People did not count down to Christmas for months. They counted supplies. They counted daylight. They counted the weeks until thaw. Christmas appeared briefly within those calculations and then disappeared again. In that sense, frontier Christmas resembled frontier life itself. Temporary. Situational. Uncertain. And quietly persistent. It did not need to be remembered perfectly. It did not need to be replicated exactly. It existed to be lived, not preserved. Later generations tried to reconstruct it anyway, drawn by the idea of a simpler holiday. But reconstruction always missed something essential. What was missing was necessity. Frontier Christmas was shaped by conditions that could not be recreated deliberately. It was not chosen simplicity. It was lived simplicity. That difference mattered. It explained why the holiday felt so unself-conscious. No one was proving anything. There was no virtue signaling in having little. There was simply little. As time passed, that context faded. Christmas accumulated layers of meaning, symbolism, and expectation. Frontier Christmas receded beneath them. Yet its influence lingered quietly. In the idea that Christmas could be calm. That it did not need to entertain constantly. That it could coexist with fatigue and still be valid. These ideas surfaced whenever people felt overwhelmed by the holiday and instinctively simplified it. They were drawing from a tradition they might not even know existed. Frontier Christmas was never codified. It left no rulebook. Its legacy survived in attitudes rather than practices. And those attitudes were subtle. A tolerance for quiet. A comfort with understatement. An acceptance that not every year would feel special. These attitudes did not make Christmas better or worse. They made it sustainable. That sustainability was its greatest achievement, even if no one recognized it at the time. Christmas on the frontier did not sparkle. It did not glow. It did not demand admiration. It simply arrived, stayed briefly, and left behind the same thing it found. People still alive. Winter still ongoing. Time still moving forward. That was enough. And in many ways, it always had been. Chapter 13. The quiet weight of having made it through. By the time Christmas ended on the American frontier, there was rarely a feeling of completion. No sense that something had been accomplished or concluded. The day did not offer closure. Instead, it left behind a subtle weight, the kind that came from having simply made it through another marked point in the year. Survival on the frontier was not measured in dramatic victories. It was measured in accumulation. One winter added to another. One Christmas followed by the next. The meaning, if there was any, emerged slowly from repetition. People did not sit back on December 26th and reflect on the holiday. Reflection required distance, and distance was not available. There was still winter to get through. Still supplies to monitor. Still weather to watch. Yet something shifted quietly after Christmas passed. The year had turned far enough to feel different, even if nothing visible had changed. Days were still short. Cold still dominated. But a mental threshold had been crossed. For many settlers, Christmas marked the psychological midpoint of winter, even if the coldest weeks still lay ahead. Having reached it, they felt marginally steadier. Not hopeful, exactly. Just oriented. This sense of orientation mattered. Winter could disorient people, making time feel endless and indistinct. Christmas provided a reference point. It reminded people that the calendar still moved. No celebration was required for this effect. The date alone did the work. Adults carried this awareness quietly. They did not announce it. They simply adjusted their thinking. Plans for spring felt slightly less abstract. Not imminent, but conceivable. Children sensed the shift without understanding it. Adults became marginally more patient. Talk of future work surfaced more often. Seeds were mentioned again, even if they remained buried in storage. The weight of having made it through Christmas was not joy. It was relief without expression. Relief did not need to be spoken to be felt. This feeling was especially noticeable in households that had struggled leading up to the holiday. If supplies had been low, if illness had lingered, if weather had been especially severe, passing Christmas without catastrophe felt significant. People did not congratulate themselves. Self-congratulation felt unnecessary. Survival was expected, not celebrated. Yet internally, people registered the milestone. Another date survived without collapse. Another reminder that routines held. Frontier life trained people to value this kind of endurance. It was not exciting, but it was essential. Christmas also marked a point after which expectations lowered again. The small allowances made for the holiday ended. Work resumed fully. Any symbolic pause was over. This return to routine felt stabilizing. Routine was safety. The brief deviation that Christmas represented, however minor, was allowed to dissolve. In this way, Christmas functioned almost like a knot in the year's rope. A place where strands tightened briefly, then relaxed. People did not linger on the holiday emotionally. They moved forward because forward movement was necessary. For some, especially those who had lost people earlier in the year, Christmas passing was a relief. It was over. The emotional tension it carried dissolved back into daily life. Grief did not end. But the day that highlighted absence was finished. For others, Christmas passing was barely noticed. It had not disrupted their rhythm enough to leave an imprint. This unevenness was typical. Frontier experiences varied widely even within similar conditions. What united them was the absence of spectacle. Christmas did not demand recovery time. It did not leave behind exhaustion from performance. It left behind nothing at all. That nothingness allowed people to refocus quickly. The frontier did not reward lingering. As January progressed, Christmas faded into the background. It was mentioned less. Its small rituals were not repeated. The year resumed its long, winter-centered arc. Christmas had been one brief notch along it. Over time, settlers learned to associate Christmas with this sense of having crossed a point. Not because the day itself provided comfort, but because its passage suggested continuity. This understanding was not articulated. It was absorbed. Later, when people spoke about frontier Christmases, they sometimes emphasized hardship. But beneath that emphasis lay something quieter. A recognition that they had endured. Christmas did not save them. It did not change conditions. It simply arrived and left without harm. That was meaningful. In environments where so many things could go wrong, a day that passed without worsening circumstances was noteworthy. Frontier people learned to appreciate neutral outcomes. Stability was success. This attitude shaped how they approached not just Christmas, but life. They did not seek constant improvement. They sought non-decline. Christmas fit neatly into that framework. It was something to get through, not something to extract maximum emotion from. In modern retellings, this restraint is often misread as joylessness. In reality, it was efficiency. Emotion was conserved for moments that demanded it. Christmas did not demand it. Instead, it offered something subtler. A shared awareness that time had moved forward again. That awareness did not require fireworks. It did not require gifts. It required only that people still be there to notice it. And on the frontier, that was never guaranteed. So when Christmas passed quietly, without loss, without disruption, without spectacle, it left behind a quiet confirmation. They were still here. Winter was still ongoing. The year was still turning. And for people whose lives depended on continuation more than celebration, that confirmation carried more weight than any feast ever could. It settled in slowly, unnoticed at the time. But it stayed. Chapter 14. What the Day Was Allowed to Be. Christmas on the American frontier survived precisely because it was allowed to be ordinary. It was never asked to rise above circumstances. It was not tasked with fixing loneliness, scarcity, or exhaustion. It was simply permitted to exist inside them, unchanged and unremarkable. This permission mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Frontier life did not tolerate illusions well. Anything that promised too much became a liability. Hope had to be realistic. Optimism had to be cautious. Christmas followed those same rules, not by design, but by necessity. People did not expect Christmas to feel good. They expected it to feel familiar. And familiarity on the frontier was a form of comfort. The day did not demand emotional performance. No one had to appear cheerful. No one had to pretend the year had been kind. Christmas did not require gratitude speeches or expressions of joy. It did not insist on mood. That absence of expectation allowed people to experience the day honestly, whatever that honesty looked like. Some felt content. Some felt tired. Some felt nothing in particular. All of those responses were acceptable. Modern celebrations often assume that Christmas must feel a certain way. Frontier Christmas made no such assumptions. Feeling neutral was not a failure. Feeling quiet was not a problem. This made the day easier to carry. Frontier people already carried enough. Tools, responsibilities, worry, weather. The holiday did not add weight. It added a name to the day and then stayed out of the way. Even the language around Christmas reflected this restraint. People said, "It's Christmas today," rather than, "It's Christmas." The phrasing mattered. It framed the day as a condition, not an event. The day did not belong to them. They moved through it the same way they moved through all days. This approach also meant that Christmas did not divide time into before and after in a dramatic way. There was no emotional buildup followed by a crash. There was only continuity. Continuity was valuable. It reduced strain. Frontier households were systems under pressure. Any disruption risked imbalance. Christmas, by remaining understated, did not destabilize those systems. Meals were slightly better, but not different enough to cause problems. Work paused slightly, but not long enough to create backlog. Emotion rose slightly, but not enough to overwhelm. Everything remained within tolerable limits. That balance was not accidental. It emerged through years of quiet adjustment. Families learned what could be added without consequence, and what could not. They learned that Christmas could exist as an accent rather than a centerpiece. In later years, when Christmas grew larger and louder, some people instinctively resisted that expansion. They were not opposed to celebration. They were wary of imbalance. Too much emphasis on one day distorted the rhythm of the year. Frontier life had taught them to protect that rhythm. This is why some descendants of frontier families retained habits of restraint long after abundance became available. They did not always know why they preferred simplicity. They just did. Those preferences were not ideological. They were inherited responses to conditions that no longer existed. Frontier Christmas also shaped how people related to disappointment. When expectations are minimal, disappointment has little room to grow. Children raised in that environment learned resilience without instruction. They learned that enjoyment could come from small variations rather than dramatic changes. They learned that a day did not need to be extraordinary to be marked. Adults, meanwhile, learned to value steadiness. A Christmas that passed without incident was a success. A Christmas that did not make winter harder was a good one. This perspective reframed satisfaction. Satisfaction was not about gain. It was about maintenance. Maintenance was a constant task on the frontier. Cabins required it. Tools required it. Bodies required it. Christmas followed suit. The holiday did not deteriorate conditions. That was its contribution. This also meant that Christmas did not overshadow other days. It did not claim emotional priority. Birthdays, if acknowledged at all, held similar weight. So did anniversaries. So did unnamed days when something quietly went right. Frontier people did not reserve meaning for holidays alone. Meaning appeared whenever conditions allowed it. Christmas simply joined that collection. This approach made the holiday resilient to loss. When someone died near Christmas, the day did not collapse under the weight of that absence. It adjusted. There were no expectations to meet and therefore none to fail. Grief existed alongside Christmas without competition. Neither displaced the other. In households where happiness was scarce that year, Christmas did not mock that scarcity by insisting otherwise. It passed without commentary. That neutrality was a kindness, even if no one named it as such. Over time, this version of Christmas became invisible to itself. It did not announce its philosophy. It did not define itself in opposition to anything. It simply worked. Later generations would try to define it retroactively, often calling it simple or humble. Those words are not wrong, but they imply intention where there was none. Frontier Christmas was not designed to be simple. It was constrained. The distinction matters. Simplicity chosen for aesthetic or moral reasons is different from simplicity imposed by circumstance. Frontier Christmas belonged firmly to the latter category. And yet, out of that imposition emerged habits and attitudes that lasted. People learned that celebration did not require transformation. That marking time did not require disruption. That meaning could coexist with fatigue. These lessons were not articulated. They were lived. When Christmas arrived year after year and nothing dramatic happened, that in itself became a kind of reassurance. The world had not ended. The routine held. This reassurance mattered more than joy would have. Joy was unpredictable. Routine was reliable. Frontier life rewarded reliability. Christmas adapted accordingly. The holiday did not compete with survival. It aligned with it. It did not claim center stage. It stood off to the side, acknowledged but unobtrusive. That positioning allowed it to persist through conditions that might have erased a more demanding celebration. Even when resources were scarce, Christmas could still occur, because it required almost nothing. A date. A pause. A recognition. Then continuation. In this way, Christmas became less about what was added and more about what was not taken away. It did not take energy that could not be spared. It did not take time that was needed elsewhere. It did not take emotional labor beyond capacity. It asked only that people notice it briefly. And on the frontier, where so many things demanded constant attention, a day that asked so little was easy to keep. That is why it survived. Not because it was cherished. Not because it was grand. But because it fit. Quietly. Unassumingly. Without ever trying to impress anyone at all. Chapter 15. What carried forward without being noticed. Long after the frontier itself began to fade, the habits formed during those early Christmases continued moving quietly through families, often without anyone realizing where they came from. Traditions outlived the conditions that created them, but they changed very little along the way. People carried forward ways of doing things that felt normal, even when they no longer made practical sense. Christmas dinners remained modest in households that could now afford more. Decorations stayed minimal even when stores offered abundance. Gifts were given carefully, sometimes sparingly, sometimes with a faint discomfort about excess. No one announced these choices as philosophy. They were just how we do it. These inherited instincts shaped family dynamics in subtle ways. Parents who grew up with restrained holidays often struggled to explain why extravagance felt wrong, even when it was possible. Children sensed the hesitation but rarely understood it. This tension sometimes produced quiet compromise. A few extra gifts. A slightly fuller table. Still, there was usually a point where expansion stopped, not because of cost, but because something internal said, "This is enough." That internal limit was not learned from books or sermons. It was inherited memory, passed down through behavior rather than explanation. Christmas, in this sense, became a container for generational memory. It held the echoes of winters when restraint had been survival, not preference. The memory was not emotional in the way modern nostalgia often is. It was practical. It lived in pacing, in moderation, in the refusal to overcommit. People who carried these habits forward often described Christmas as quiet or simple, without feeling the need to justify it. Loudness felt unnecessary. Excess felt awkward. In some families, this restraint softened over time. In others, it hardened into tradition. Either way, its origins remain mostly unexamined. Even language carried traces of the frontier. Phrases like, "It's just a day," or "We don't make a big fuss," appeared again and again. These were not dismissive statements. They were grounding ones. They reduced pressure. Pressure, after all, had been dangerous on the frontier. Emotional pressure could distract. Financial pressure could destroy. Social pressure could isolate. Christmas had once avoided pressure by being modest. That avoidance lingered. In communities formed by former frontier families, holidays often emphasized continuity over spectacle. Church services were calm. Gatherings were predictable. Food was familiar. Newcomers sometimes found these celebrations underwhelming. They expected excitement and found steadiness instead. Steadiness, however, had been the point. Even as America industrialized and urbanized, some of these frontier-influenced attitudes persisted in rural areas and small towns. Christmas remained something you fit into life, not something life revolved around. Work schedules adjusted slightly, not completely. Travel was limited. Expectations remained local. The holidays stayed geographically small. This local focus mattered. Frontier Christmas had always been bounded by what could be reached on foot or by horse. That constraint shaped how people understood celebration. Even when travel became easier, some families retained an instinctive resistance to long-distance holiday movement. Christmas felt like something that happened at home, wherever home happened to be. This attachment to place was another inheritance. Frontier homes were not interchangeable. Each cabin represented labor invested, risk endured, survival achieved. Leaving it, even temporarily, carried weight. Christmas reinforced that attachment by being experienced within those walls, year after year. Later homes inherited some of that gravity, even when they no longer needed to. This is why some people feel a quiet pull to return to a childhood home at Christmas, even if they cannot articulate why. The holiday activates a sense of rootedness that predates modern mobility. It is not about the house itself. It is about continuity. Frontier Christmas taught that continuity was worth preserving. The holiday also carried forward lessons about generosity. Giving on the frontier had been cautious. Resources were finite. Gifts were measured. That caution did not erase generosity. It shaped it. Giving became thoughtful rather than abundant. Practical rather than symbolic. Focused on need rather than display. These values persisted. Even in times of plenty, some families emphasized usefulness over surprise. Socks, tools, books, items meant to last. This was not a rejection of joy. It was an investment in stability. Frontier life had rewarded investments that lasted. Christmas gifts followed the same logic. Over time, this approach sometimes clashed with broader cultural trends. Commercial Christmas encouraged spectacle, volume, novelty. Families influenced by frontier restraint often navigated this clash quietly. They participated selectively. They opted out without protest. They did not argue against excess. They simply did less. This quiet resistance was effective because it required no explanation. It did not demand agreement. It functioned through example. Children raised in these environments absorbed the rhythm without instruction. They learned that anticipation did not need to escalate dramatically. That satisfaction did not depend on quantity. They learned patience without naming it. Of course, not all frontier-influenced traditions survived intact. Some were softened, others forgotten. But the underlying orientation toward moderation remained surprisingly durable. It adapted to new contexts. In suburban homes, it looked like smaller gatherings. In urban apartments, it looked like fewer decorations. In blended families, it looked like simplified schedules. The specifics changed. The restraint remained. This restraint also shaped how people handled the emotional weight of Christmas. Without expectations of constant happiness, disappointment carried less sting. If Christmas was allowed to be uneven, then uneven years were not failures. This perspective offered resilience during hardship. Economic downturns, illness, loss. Frontier Christmas had never promised relief from hardship. It had simply existed alongside it. That coexistence became a model. Even today, people who approach Christmas with minimal expectation often report less stress, though they may not connect this to frontier inheritance. They may simply say, "We keep it low-key." Low-key in this context is not indifference. It is accommodation. It acknowledges that life continues. Frontier life had required constant accommodation. Weather shifted. Supplies ran low. Plans changed. Christmas learned to adapt rather than insist. That adaptability is perhaps its most enduring legacy. When traditions are flexible, they survive disruption. When they demand precision, they fracture. Frontier Christmas survived blizzards, shortages, isolation, and exhaustion precisely because it did not demand precision. That lesson traveled forward through time, embedded in habits rather than history books. It shaped how people scheduled, how they hosted, how they gave, how they felt. It shaped what Christmas was allowed to be. And perhaps more importantly, what it was not required to be. In the end, the frontier did not create a romantic Christmas. It created a workable one. A Christmas that could exist under pressure. A Christmas that did not collapse when conditions were poor. A Christmas that did not collapse when conditions were poor. A Christmas that required very little and therefore endured. That endurance is easy to overlook because it lacks drama. But it is also why, centuries later, Christmas still arrives quietly in many homes, unassuming and restrained, content to be noticed and then folded back into ordinary life. Just as it once was. And just as it learned to be, a long time ago, in places where survival came first, and celebration learned to wait its turn. Chapter 16. When nothing special still mattered. There were years on the frontier when Christmas barely registered as different at all. No visitors arrived. No extra food appeared. No gifts changed hands. The day passed with the same weather, the same chores, the same quiet fatigue as the days before and after it. And yet, even then, it still mattered. Not in a visible way. Not in a way that could be measured or documented. It mattered because it existed as a marker, however faint, in a landscape where days often blurred together. Frontier time was not neatly segmented. Weeks were not always counted. Months drifted by according to weather and labor rather than calendars. Winter especially compressed time into long stretches of sameness. Christmas provided a small interruption in that sameness, even when it added nothing tangible. People noticed the date. They said it aloud. "It's Christmas," someone might remark, without ceremony. The statement did not invite response. It simply acknowledged placement in time. That acknowledgement was enough. On the frontier, noticing where you were in the year had practical importance. It reminded people how much winter remained. It framed expectations. It recalibrated patience. Christmas sat roughly at winter's midpoint, a quiet reminder that survival had already been happening for weeks and would need to continue for weeks more. This positioning gave the day a subtle weight. It was not celebratory. It was orienting. Orientation mattered in environments where isolation could distort perception. When days were spent alone or in small groups, when snow erased familiar landmarks, when routines repeated endlessly, it was easy to lose a sense of progression. Christmas anchored time without demanding action. Even when no one paused work, the knowledge that it was Christmas lingered in the background, like a date penciled lightly in the margin of a ledger. People did not stop chopping wood because it was Christmas. They did not skip feeding animals. They did not delay repairs. But they might chop a little slower. They might talk a little more. They might stand in silence for a moment longer than usual. These changes were not planned. They emerged naturally from recognition. Recognition altered pacing. Frontier life was relentless. Any moment that allowed for slight adjustment was noticeable. Christmas allowed that adjustment without requiring justification. It was not a day off. It was a day acknowledged. That distinction allowed the holiday to exist even when circumstances were unforgiving. In households where illness lingered, Christmas did not disappear. It was mentioned quietly. In households where food was scarce, Christmas did not vanish. It was simply unadorned. The day did not compete with need. It coexisted with it. This coexistence gave Christmas a peculiar durability. It could not be cancelled, because there was nothing to cancel. No feast to postpone. No gathering to reschedule. No expectation to fulfill. The day arrived whether anyone prepared for it or not. That inevitability mattered. Frontier people understood inevitability well. Seasons arrived without negotiation. Weather did what it wanted. Supplies ran out on their own schedules. Christmas fit into this worldview neatly. It was another thing that arrived when it arrived. People adjusted accordingly. Children learned this early. They learned that Christmas might look different each year. They learned not to expect consistency. This inconsistency did not confuse them. It trained them. They learned flexibility before they learned disappointment. Adults, meanwhile, learned to let go of comparison. There were no neighbors nearby to compare celebrations with. There were no advertisements to create expectation. Christmas was what it was locally that year. That local specificity removed pressure. Modern celebrations often collapse under the weight of comparison. Frontier Christmas existed beyond comparison. Even when families lived near one another, differences were expected. One household might have more food. Another might have less. No one assumed equality. Christmas did not erase these differences. It simply passed through them. In some years, Christmas arrived during crisis. Storms, accidents, crop failure. In those years, the day took on a subdued tone, but it did not disappear. Someone might say, "Well, it's Christmas," as a statement of fact, not comfort. The phrase did not solve anything. It did not promise improvement. It acknowledged the day's presence amid difficulty. This acknowledgement mattered because it prevented erasure. It prevented time from becoming shapeless. Frontier people lived close to conditions that could flatten experience. Hunger, cold, isolation had a way of reducing life to immediate need. Christmas, by existing even minimally, reintroduced dimension. It reminded people that the year had structure, that this hardship existed within a larger cycle. This reminder did not offer escape. It offered context. Context is quieter than hope, but often more useful. Hope can feel fragile when conditions are harsh. Context feels steadier. Christmas provided context. It said implicitly that this winter was one among many. That others had reached this point before. That time continued. This continuity mattered deeply, even if it was rarely articulated. In diaries and letters, Christmas was sometimes mentioned almost in passing. It was Christmas Day. Cold. Or, Christmas passed quietly. These brief notes reveal how the day functioned. It did not demand description. It was enough to mark it. Marking the day acknowledged participation in something larger than immediate circumstance. Even isolated cabins were connected, through the calendar, to distant places. Other people were also experiencing Christmas, in their own restrained ways. This connection was abstract but real. It reduced the sense of complete isolation. Frontier people did not need Christmas to feel joyful to feel connected. They needed it to feel shared. Shared time created a quiet bond. This bond did not require communication. It existed simply because the date was recognized across distances. In this way, Christmas functioned almost like a signal. A subtle synchronization. Everyone, wherever they were, knew roughly what day it was. That knowledge mattered. Over time, this understated function of Christmas shaped how people thought about belonging. Belonging did not require proximity. It required shared markers. Christmas was one of those markers. Even when celebrated alone, it linked individuals to a wider human rhythm. This rhythm was not festive. It was temporal. Frontier life often stripped away external markers of belonging. Towns were distant. Institutions were sparse. Community was fragile. Time itself became one of the few shared structures. Christmas reinforced that structure. This is perhaps why Christmas survived even when other traditions faded. It was not dependent on resources. It was dependent on recognition. Recognition is inexpensive. As long as people knew the date, Christmas could occur. No materials required. This minimal requirement made it adaptable to every possible condition. Blizzards did not cancel it. Illness did not erase it. Exhaustion did not eliminate it. The day remained. Over generations, this persistence shaped attitudes toward significance. Something did not need to be elaborate to be meaningful. Meaning could exist quietly, almost invisibly. Frontier Christmas taught that lesson without instruction. People absorbed it through repetition. Year after year, the day arrived. Year after year it passed. Sometimes gently. Sometimes heavily. Sometimes unnoticed. But always there. This consistency created trust. Trust that time would continue to move. Trust that markers would return. In environments where so much was uncertain, this trust was valuable. Christmas did not solve problems. It did not change conditions. It did not rescue anyone from hardship. But it did confirm that the calendar still worked. That the year still turned. That winter had not frozen time entirely. In the end, perhaps this was Christmas's quietest contribution on the frontier. Not celebration. Not comfort. But continuity. The assurance that even when nothing special happened, the day still arrived, and by arriving, it mattered. Not loudly. Not impressively. Just enough. And that, on the frontier, was often all that was needed. Chapter 17. The Years That Blurred Together. As time went on, many frontier settlers found it difficult to remember individual Christmases at all. They remembered patterns instead. Winters merged. Years stacked quietly on top of one another. The holiday did not stand out enough to separate one season from the next. This was not forgetfulness. It was compression. Frontier life compressed memory by necessity. When each year demanded the same labor, the same vigilance, the same negotiation with weather and scarcity, individual moments lost their edges. What remained was rhythm. Christmas became part of that rhythm. People could recall that Christmases happened, but not always which one held which detail. They remembered that there was usually cold. Usually some mention of the day. Usually a slight pause in conversation or routine. Specifics faded quickly. This fading was not experienced as loss. It was simply how memory worked when nothing demanded emphasis. Modern memory tends to cluster around events. Frontier memory clustered around endurance. What stood out were not holidays, but disruptions. Illness that lingered. A winter that was worse than usual. A year when crops failed entirely. Christmas was not designed to compete with those memories. It settled in between them. As a result, When people later spoke of their frontier years, Christmas appeared more as an atmosphere than a series of events. They might say, "Christmas was quiet," or "We didn't do much for Christmas," and leave it at that. The lack of detail was not avoidance. It was accuracy. There was not much to tell. This absence of narrative made Christmas strangely resilient. It did not require storytelling to sustain it. It did not rely on memory to justify its place. It happened whether it was remembered or not. Children growing up in these conditions learned that not every year needed to be distinguished. They learned that sameness was not inherently negative. Sameness meant stability. Frontier life rewarded stability above all else. Stable food sources. Stable shelter. Stable routines. Christmas conformed to that value. Rather than interrupting the year, it confirmed its pattern. This meant that time moved differently around the holiday. There was no dramatic build-up, no aftermath. Christmas arrived and left without ripple. This allowed people to return to work without emotional adjustment. There was no need to recalibrate expectations. Life continued. For settlers already stretched thin, this continuity reduced strain. Emotionally intense events require recovery. Frontier life rarely allowed time for that. Christmas, by being emotionally modest, did not demand recovery. People could acknowledge the day and move on. This ability to move on mattered. Frontier survival depended on momentum. Tasks accumulated quickly. Delays had consequences. A holiday that lingered emotionally would have been disruptive. Christmas avoided this by remaining understated. In some families, elders would later struggle to explain Christmas traditions to younger generations who had grown up elsewhere. When asked what they did, they often answered vaguely, "We just had dinner. We just stayed home. There wasn't much to it." These answers were not evasive. They reflected the truth. There had not been much to it. And yet, the holiday persisted. Its persistence despite minimal expression suggests that Christmas served a function beyond celebration. It functioned as a checkpoint. A moment to notice that the year had progressed. A reminder that endurance had continued. Frontier people measured success in survival, not enjoyment. Christmas aligned with that metric. If Christmas arrived and the household was still intact, that was enough. The holiday did not need to add pleasure to justify itself. Its arrival implied continuity. This is why some settlers later described Christmas with a kind of neutral respect. They did not romanticize it. They did not dismiss it. They acknowledged it as part of the landscape of time, like a familiar bend in a river. Always there. Never dramatic. Memory treated it accordingly. When people later recalled their lives, they remembered the feel of winters more than individual dates. Cold months blended together, punctuated by work and weather. Christmas existed inside those memories as a general sense rather than a specific event. This generality made it adaptable. As circumstances changed, Christmas could expand slightly without losing its identity. But in its original form, on the frontier, it did not seek expansion. It was content to be one more quiet passage in a long sequence of similar days. This contentment made it durable. Frontier life eliminated many things that demanded attention without offering utility. Christmas survived because it did not demand attention. It accepted being noticed briefly and then forgotten. That humility is easy to overlook. Modern holidays often fight for memory. They aim to be unforgettable. Frontier Christmas made no such attempt. It did not compete for space in memory. It existed in the background. Background elements are often the most stable. They shape experience without drawing focus. Christmas shaped the year this way. It provided a subtle midpoint, a shared acknowledgement, a quiet hinge. Then it stepped back. Over decades, this pattern trained people to think about time differently. Time was not a series of peaks and valleys. It was a steady line with occasional markers. Christmas was one of those markers. It did not define the year. It indicated progress within it. This orientation toward time reduced emotional volatility. When no single day carries excessive weight, disappointment has less impact. Frontier people needed this emotional economy. Resources were limited. Emotional energy was no exception. Christmas respected that limit. It asked only for recognition, not investment. As settlers aged, this approach influenced how they advised younger generations. When children or grandchildren expressed anxiety about holidays, elders often responded with reassurance rather than instruction. "It'll be fine. It's just Christmas." These phrases carried accumulated experience. They reflected decades of holidays that passed without drama. They communicated trust and continuity. This trust was earned through repetition. Each year that Christmas arrived and passed without catastrophe reinforced the idea that the day was manageable. Even during difficult years, Christmas did not break anything. This reliability mattered. Frontier life contained many uncertainties. Weather could betray expectations. Crops could fail. Health could decline suddenly. Christmas, by contrast, was predictable. It arrived on schedule. It did not change much. It did not surprise anyone. In uncertain environments, predictability becomes valuable. Christmas offered that predictability. Even when people forgot individual details, they remembered the pattern. They remembered that Christmas happened. That was enough. This pattern-following version of Christmas did not inspire nostalgia in the modern sense. There were no vivid images to revisit. Instead, it created a baseline sense of steadiness. Steadiness is harder to romanticize, but easier to live with. Frontier people lived with it year after year. They allowed Christmas to blur. They allowed it to blend. They allowed it to be unremarkable. And in doing so, they ensured that it never became burdensome. The years blurred together, but Christmas remained inside that blur, quietly intact. Not as a highlight. Not as a memory anchor. But as a dependable presence, marking time without asking to be remembered. Which, on the frontier, was perhaps the most practical way for a holiday to survive at all. Chapter 18. When survival stopped being the lesson. At some point, for many families, survival stopped being the central lesson of Christmas. This shift did not happen suddenly, and it did not happen evenly. It arrived quietly, unevenly, and often without announcement. One year, there was enough food without careful counting. Another year, the roof held without constant worry. Another winter passed without illness lingering quite so long. Nothing dramatic marked the change. There was no clear moment when people said, "Now we are safe." They simply noticed, gradually, that Christmas no longer needed to prove anything. On the frontier, Christmas had once functioned as confirmation. If the family reached December and was still functioning, that meant something had gone right. The holiday quietly validated endurance. As conditions improved, that validation became less necessary. Christmas did not disappear as a result. It shifted roles. Instead of confirming survival, it began to mark stability. This was a subtle change, but it mattered. Stability feels different from survival. Survival is urgent. Stability is quieter. Survival demands attention. Stability allows distraction. Christmas, having been shaped by urgency, adjusted slowly to this new environment. People did not immediately know what to do with extra margin. In early years of relative comfort, Christmas often looked much like it always had, even when more was possible. Habits persisted beyond necessity. This persistence was not stubbornness. It was caution. Frontier life had trained people to distrust sudden abundance. Extra resources could vanish quickly. Good years were followed by bad ones. Christmas remained restrained because restraint had been protective. Over time, however, some households allowed small changes. An extra dish at dinner. A purchased item instead of a homemade one. A gift that was wanted rather than needed. These additions were tested slowly. If they did not disrupt the household, they stayed. If they created stress, they disappeared again. Christmas became a place where people experimented carefully with abundance. Not indulgence. Experimentation. Would this make life easier or harder? Would this feel helpful or excessive? Would this complicate things? Frontier-influenced families tended to remove anything that complicated things. Christmas was still not allowed to create debt, exhaustion, or conflict. Those were unacceptable costs. Even as survival ceased to be the immediate concern, its lessons remained active. The holiday continued to prioritize function over display. In many households, Christmas expanded just enough to acknowledge improved circumstances, and no further. This expansion often looked modest from the outside. To participants, however, it felt significant. A store-bought toy instead of a carved one. A dessert that required ingredients not previously available. A printed card instead of a spoken greeting. These changes were noticed. They marked a shift from necessity toward choice. Choice altered the emotional landscape of Christmas. When survival dominated, choices were limited. When options increased, so did decision-making. Decision-making introduced new forms of quiet stress. What to include? What to exclude? What was appropriate now? People accustomed to clear limits found this new ambiguity mildly unsettling. Christmas no longer came with obvious constraints. It required judgment. Judgment demanded reflection. This reflection often happened silently. Families adjusted without discussion. They tried things. They observed reactions. They adjusted again. Christmas became an evolving practice rather than a fixed routine. Despite this evolution, many core features remained. The day was still calm. The tone was still restrained. The emphasis remained on being together rather than performing celebration. Survival may have stopped being the lesson, but moderation did not. Moderation had become internalized. Even as frontier conditions receded into memory, the mindset persisted. People still preferred not to overdo things. They still resisted excess without feeling the need to justify that resistance. Christmas still felt like something that could easily become too much. So they kept it from doing so. This restraint sometimes puzzled outsiders. Visitors from more celebratory backgrounds occasionally interpreted the calm as lack of enthusiasm. They mistook steadiness for disinterest. Those inside these households understood the difference. They felt contentment rather than excitement. Contentment was quieter, but it was stable. Frontier Christmas had trained people to value stability. Even when survival was no longer at stake, stability remained desirable. The holiday continued to function as a regulator. It prevented extremes. It reminded people to keep things manageable. This regulatory role became more apparent as Christmas culture outside these families grew louder. As advertisements promised happiness and transformation, restrained households quietly opted out. Not as a statement. As a habit. They did not feel deprived. They felt protected. Protected from overstimulation. Protected from obligation. Protected from disappointment. Christmas, in these spaces, was still allowed to be imperfect. That permission traced directly back to frontier experience. When survival was uncertain, perfection had been irrelevant. That lesson endured. Even when resources increased, perfection remained unnecessary. This perspective shaped emotional responses. If a dish failed, it was fine. If a gift disappointed, it passed. If the day felt ordinary, that was acceptable. Christmas did not need to justify itself. It simply needed to arrive and leave without damage. This approach influenced how people talked about Christmas afterward. They rarely described it in superlatives. They said, "It was nice," or "It went well." These phrases carried weight. Well meant nothing broke. Nice meant no one was overwhelmed. That was success. Over time, this understanding spread unevenly through society. Some families embraced expansion and spectacle. Others retained restraint. The difference often traced back to earlier conditions, though few recognized the connection. Frontier influence persisted quietly, shaping expectations without explanation. Even among those who did not know their family history, the habits remained. They felt instinctive. Christmas should not be stressful. Christmas should not be expensive beyond comfort. Christmas should not exhaust anyone. These beliefs were rarely stated as rules. They functioned as internal checks. When something crossed a line, people felt it immediately. They pulled back. This instinctive regulation is one of the frontier's lasting gifts to Christmas culture. Not excitement, not nostalgia, but limits. Limits protect. They keep celebrations sustainable. They allow repetition without burnout. Frontier Christmas survived because it respected limits imposed by reality. Later Christmases, shaped by that legacy, survived because they respected limits imposed by people. Even when survival stopped being the lesson, the habit of restraint remained useful. Life continued to be unpredictable. Resources fluctuated. Stress accumulated. Christmas, shaped by earlier necessity, remained flexible enough to absorb these changes. It did not demand constant reinvention. It adapted without complaint. In households influenced by this tradition, Christmas remained something that fit into life rather than dominating it. It acknowledged improvement without forgetting difficulty. It allowed enjoyment without excess. It permitted comfort without indulgence. This balance was not carefully engineered. It was inherited. And it continued quietly year after year. Christmas no longer needed to prove survival. But it still carried the memory of when it once had to. That memory shaped what it was allowed to become. Not bigger. Not louder. Just steadier. And in a world that rarely stays steady for long, that quiet steadiness remained valuable. Even after survival stopped being the lesson, Christmas continued to teach it indirectly. By showing that continuity matters. By reminding people that enough is often sufficient. By existing without demanding transformation. Just as it always had, back when survival was the only thing anyone could be certain about at all. Chapter 19. When memory became gentler than truth. As decades passed, the memory of frontier Christmas began to soften. Not because people lied about it, but because memory itself has a way of smoothing sharp edges when they are no longer needed. Hardship receded into background knowledge. What remained was tone. People remembered that Christmas had been quiet. They remembered that it had been modest. They remembered that it had not been easy, but they no longer felt the difficulty in their bodies. Memory does that. It removes physical strain first. The cold becomes descriptive rather than biting. Hunger becomes conceptual rather than urgent. Fatigue becomes something that happened, not something that still weighs on the muscles. Christmas, remembered later, inherited this gentleness. What had once been endurance slowly became simplicity. What had once been necessity slowly became tradition. This transformation was not dishonest. It was adaptive. People did not need the full weight of those winters anymore. The lesson had already been learned. So memory kept what was useful and let the rest fade. The useful part was restraint. The useful part was steadiness. The useful part was the idea that Christmas did not need to overwhelm to matter. This selective remembering shaped how stories were told. When elders spoke of Christmas long ago, they rarely led with difficulty. They mentioned calm. They mentioned togetherness. They mentioned that people may do. They did not linger on fear or exhaustion. Not because those things were absent, but because they were no longer instructive. The instruction had already been absorbed. Younger listeners often imagine frontier Christmas as austere but peaceful. A cabin. Snow. A fire. A quiet meal. This image was incomplete, but not entirely wrong. It captured the emotional residue, if not the lived reality. Memory preserved the residue. That residue became influential. It shaped how later generations defined what a good Christmas looked like. A good Christmas was calm. A good Christmas was manageable. A good Christmas did not spiral. These values were inherited through memory rather than experience. People felt connected to a past they had not lived through by emulating its emotional tone. They recreated quiet without recreating hardship. This process turned frontier Christmas into something symbolic. It became a reference point. When modern celebrations felt excessive, people invoked the past, sometimes vaguely. They didn't have much back then. They kept it simple. These statements were not historical analyses. They were emotional calibrations. They served to pull things back into alignment. The past functioned as a stabilizer. It reminded people that Christmas could exist without abundance. This reminder carried authority because it was rooted in survival. Even if details were softened, the core truth remained: Christmas had survived worse conditions than modern inconvenience. That truth gave people permission to let go of pressure. Memory, in this sense, became practical. It did not need to be precise. It needed to be useful. Frontier Christmas, remembered gently, provided that usefulness. It offered a model of sufficiency. This model influenced behavior in subtle ways. People felt less compelled to impress, less compelled to perform joy, less compelled to meet imagined standards. They allowed Christmas to be quieter, citing history even if they did not know it well. The idea of a simpler past did important work. It countered modern escalation. It suggested that something essential would remain even if decorations were fewer or gifts were smaller. That suggestion reduced anxiety. Memory also softened judgment. When Christmas did not meet expectations, people reassured themselves by thinking of earlier generations who had endured far worse. This comparison did not invalidate disappointment. It contextualized it. Context reduces intensity. Frontier memory provided context. Over time, this gentle memory became part of cultural storytelling. Books, films, and anecdotes reinforced the idea of modest frontier holidays. They emphasized resilience and togetherness. They rarely showed exhaustion. They rarely showed monotony. They rarely showed the long, silent stretches of winter that made Christmas feel like just another day. These omissions were not malicious. They reflected what people wanted to remember. Memory prioritizes meaning over accuracy. The meaning people wanted from Frontier Christmas was endurance without bitterness. They wanted a story where difficulty did not destroy spirit. Christmas became the symbol through which that story was told. Even if the real experience had been more complex, the symbol held. This symbolic Christmas influenced how people approached their own lives. When resources felt tight, they reminded themselves that others had managed with less. When celebrations felt overwhelming, they scaled back, citing a quieter past. The past, remembered gently, became permission. Permission to do less. Permission to simplify. Permission to opt out. This permission was valuable. Modern life produces its own forms of pressure. Time pressure. Financial pressure. Social pressure. Christmas amplifies those pressures. The memory of frontier restraint offered an alternative narrative. It said implicitly that Christmas does not demand intensity. It never has. Even if that was not entirely true in lived experience, it was true in outcome. Christmas endured. The memory of endurance mattered more than the memory of struggle. As generations moved further from the frontier, the details faded further. What remained was atmosphere. Quiet rooms. Soft light. Limited expectations. These elements became aesthetic choices rather than necessities. People recreated them deliberately. They chose simplicity. They dimmed lights. They reduced schedules. They spoke of wanting a simple Christmas, often without realizing how deeply rooted that desire was. This desire was not nostalgia for hardship. It was nostalgia for emotional manageability. Frontier Christmas had been emotionally manageable because it was constrained. Memory preserved that manageability while discarding the constraint. This created a new version of simplicity, one that was chosen rather than imposed. This choice carried a different emotional tone. It felt calm rather than tense. It felt intentional rather than resigned. But its shape was inherited. The quietness, the restraint, the absence of spectacle. These features trace back to frontier conditions, even if the connection was no longer explicit. Memory bridged that gap. It allowed people to feel continuity without carrying burden. This is how traditions survive long after their original purpose fades. They become lighter. They become symbolic. They become adaptable. Frontier Christmas, remembered gently, became a tool for modern balance. It helped people resist excess without rejecting celebration. It allowed Christmas to remain meaningful without becoming overwhelming. The gentleness of memory did not erase truth. It transformed it. The truth of frontier Christmas was endurance. Memory reshaped endurance into steadiness. Steadiness into simplicity. Simplicity into choice. This progression made the past usable. People did not need to reenact hardship to honor it. They honored it by keeping Christmas from becoming unmanageable. They honored it by allowing quiet. They honored it by letting the day be ordinary if it needed to be. Memory, in this sense, performed a service. It filtered out what was no longer necessary. It retained what still mattered. What still mattered was not how difficult Christmas had been. What still mattered was that it had survived difficulty without demanding transformation. That lesson remained intact. Even as details softened, the core persisted. Christmas did not need to be extraordinary to be meaningful. It did not need to solve anything. It did not need to justify itself. This understanding, passed down through softened memory, shaped expectations. It allowed people to approach Christmas with less fear of failure. If things went wrong, they remembered that Christmas had endured worse. If things were quiet, they remembered that quiet had once been the norm. Memory, gentler than truth, provided reassurance. It did not tell the whole story. It told the useful part. And that part was enough. Enough to keep Christmas grounded. Enough to keep it from collapsing under pressure. Enough to let it continue year after year, adapting quietly, just as it always had. The frontier faded. The hardship faded. But the memory, softened and selective, remained. Not as a burden. As a guide. A quiet reminder that Christmas does not need to be heavy to last. It only needs to fit. And because of that gentler memory, it still does.